decided to step in and, okay, recording has started. Sorry about that, I should have pressed that record button. So these groups or these organizations were all NDIP partners. The NDIP is the National Digital Information Infrastructure and Preservation Program. That's a big acronym, which is the precursor to the National Digital Stewardship Alliance, or NDSA, which is hosted and is a consortium of about 165 or so partnering organizations, universities, professional associations, government agencies, nonprofits, etc., who are all committed to the long-term preservation of digital information. So all of these groups were already doing web archiving of the .gov domain at various levels and scopes. As you can see here, the Library of Congress was harvesting election materials and other materials in the .gov domain. The government printing office was harvesting agency websites and ephemeral documents. The National Archives was actually doing web harvesting, but they were focusing on congressional committees and Congress, and doing a web harvest every 2 years at the end of a congressional session, which of course runs for 2 years. The Internet Archive was doing global, national domain and curated crawls of all sorts. And executive agencies were also using Archivit to preserve their own domains. On the academic side, University of North Texas and Stanford and others were doing topical and targeted .gov collecting. So as you can see, there was already a lot of activity going on in this space by lots of institutions. But by coming together, we felt we could build a community of experts and interests around the effort of crawling the .gov/.mil domain, expand on all of our collections, and leverage economies of scale. So we did have some goals that were set up at the very beginning, and those goals continue to drive the end of term project. We've done an end of term in 2008, 2012, and now in 2016. And we seek to work collaboratively to preserve public U.S. government websites, to document the federal agency's presence on the web during the end of presidential terms, when the .gov web space is particularly volatile. Enhance the existing research collections of all of the partner institutions, raise awareness about the need for preservation, and engage with researchers and subject experts and the public to move the project forward. Excuse me, I have a bit of a cold today. I hope I don't sound too honky. So in the many hands make light work model, all of the participating organizations have taken on various pieces of the work at hand. The main actual crawling organizations, the Internet Archive, Library of Congress, and University of North Texas in 2008 and 2012, as well as George Washington University this time around, which is harvesting social media for us. But there's also preservation, data transfers, and indexing, and metadata creation and indexing, and a web portal which the California Digital Library is hosting, which includes the indexing of all the metadata. There's nominations, URL or seed nominations, we call them, which GPO is doing in terms of outreach to their community, to the FDLP community, the Federal Depository Library Program community. And all of us are really doing seed contributions, outreach, project management, education, coordination, and the whole lot. There's really only 8 to 10 of us that are working on this project, and so it takes a lot of our time to do this. At first, we were all focused on almost primarily on collecting and preserving of .gov content. But over time, over the last iterations of the crawl, we've also worked to expand access, first through the web portal that CDL is hosting, but then also expanding the ways that researchers can use the archive. And Jefferson will talk about that in a few minutes. So there's the technical work of harvesting and metadata and indexing. I saw in the chat that someone really loves metadata, so there's definitely space for you here. But also much outreach and coordination of volunteer nominators and nomination events and journalist and public inquiries. The number of volunteers has grown, especially this year, with the perceived notion of the loss of government information and data, especially climate data, and extreme public interest in preserving and assuring access to government information. So in some ways, it's never been a better time to be a government information librarian. This is the slide loads. So we have a ton of funding. Actually, no. There's no outside funding or grants for this project, at least that I know of. It's been paid for by the organizations, the institutional resources, the web archiving programs, and the people participating in this project. It's pretty much a sweat equity kind of project, and it's done well in that manner. Not to say that a big grant wouldn't be welcome, of course, but I think it's highly commendable that the people and the organizations working on this project are doing so because they understand the importance of digital preservation and public access to government information in all of its guises. I'm not seeing the arrow here. Hold on 1 second. Yeah, here we go. So defining exactly what is the government web presence has been one of the biggest challenges for the project. The government domain ebbs and flows, contracts and expands, mostly expands, and goes beyond .gov and .mil domain. In 2008, we started with the data set from NARA's 2004 crawl, and we created and collected other bulk lists of seed URLs, for example, from the Stanford web-based project, and have grown that list over the 3 crawl cycles. At first, even the US government didn't have a comprehensive list of top-level domains and subdomains. This time around, it's been a bit easier to get bulk lists from the government itself, as the government transparency efforts of the Obama administration has spurred the federal government to make that information publicly available. So we've got lists from data.gov, USA.gov, and 18F, which is the Internet Services Group from the General Services Administration, or GSA. And this year we've also received, for the first time, a bulk seed list from Google, perhaps the largest web crawler out there. So we start with these bulk lists of domains, but then we also have relied on volunteer subject experts, and this year especially other grassroots efforts that can help us identify specific seeds that are important to capture, but that may not be at the top level domain bulk lists. It's important to get nominations on top of having bulk lists to assure the most thorough crawls as possible. Starting with some very positive press in the New York Times in late November 2016, our efforts at community engagement have really taken off. A special hat tip to Professor Debbie Rabina at Pratt University's Library School. She was a very active early supporter of the end-of-term project and had a library class in 2012 and again in 2016, which helped identify social media and other seeds. And she's also put together events of subject experts to do seed nominations for us. Other events and efforts include the Data Refuge Project, started by the University of Pennsylvania Libraries, and University of Toronto's guerrilla archiving efforts. Other libraries and organizations across the country have hosted hackathons and nominatathons, or whatever we're calling them these days, and are both collecting their own data. For example, the Climate Mirror, which I didn't put on this slide, but you can look them up, climatemirror.org, as well as feeding seeds and data into the end-of-term crawl, or end-of-term archive. These efforts are not wastefully duplicative, but instead have helped us all learn and make for a more thorough web crawl. We've gotten a lot of press, as I said, over the last several months. You may have seen the Wired articles and the New York Review of Books and several others. Sorry for the police presence outside. It's not me, I swear. So, as I said, we've gotten some really good press in the last few months, which has sustained the interest in the project and in preserving Born Digital GovInfo and data. This has been both a blessing and a bit of a curse, and I say that only slightly facetiously. It has definitely made outreach easier and has made arguing for participating in the end-of-term crawl easier for those of us who are participating with our own administrations. And we're thankful for all the public interest and the public events and the positive energy. But the amount of journalistic interest has meant spending a lot more time for all of us volunteers explaining the project and the ins and outs of web archiving to reporters. So our primary means of organizing volunteers has been through the University of North Texas's nomination tool. Some of you may have seen this if you've been tracking on the end of term over the last 6 or 8 months. In 2008, we had 457 seeds nominated from 26 nominators. In 2012, that was the number of nominators slightly grew, and the number of seeds grew a lot to 1,476. And then in 2016, this is the year with all the public interest and the public angst, we've had many more nominations and nominators. So we've had over 15,000 seeds nominated from over 400 nominators just through the University of North Texas's nomination form. And we've also had over 100,000 seeds nominated from events and tools hosted and created by Data Rescue, as well as the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative, or EDGI. Both of these groups ran lots of public events. So this has been truly phenomenal and has helped spur efforts by a group of libraries coalescing around the website called libraries.network to collaboratively work on the preservation of digital government information going forward, and not just at the end of each presidential term. This is Jefferson's favorite slide, and I'm sorry that I stole it from you. The .gov sites proliferate, of course, just like invasive species. And yes, there once was an invasive species.gov website, which went dark, but the Internet Archive has it in the Wayback Machine. So government websites are ephemeral, and in many cases, it can be difficult. It can be difficult to gather them as they expand and change over time, and as social media and other kinds of web apps and tools take hold. There's .gov and .mil, of course, as I said, but there's also a lot of government information on the .com domain. For example, all of the armed forces have .com websites, and the .org domain, which includes many commissions, and the Federal Reserve, federalreserve.org, as well as YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and other social media. So we've had to rely heavily on nominations from subject experts in these areas. Sometimes the bulk seeds that we get can get to these sites with crawlers following links, as is their wont. But it's always great to have the community help identifying seeds. There are, of course, issues with web crawling as a viable option to collection and preservation. Nobody is saying that web crawling or web harvesting is a perfect tool, but it is what we have. So some sites, of course, are not publicly accessible or are unlisted. Some are only found through dogged efforts of subject experts who know where to look for and know how to identify them. This is especially true for things like datasets, underlying mapping, and other web apps. There's some content we're unable to archive, like sites behind passwords, databases that need to be humanly queried, though the Internet Archive has some cool workarounds to this problem. There's web applications, as I said, and some data sets are really difficult to find and harvest. The proliferation or invasiveness of government websites continues almost unabated, meaning that overall the .gov space continues to expand much like a supernova, though I hope that metaphor doesn't prove predictive. There was an effort by the Obama administration's Office of Digital Strategy back in 2011 to tighten up the .gov domain and curtail what was seen as quote-unquote duplicate and unnecessary websites that waste money. This website, too, was lost to the sands of Internet time, which, according to the Internet Archive, is about 100 days. It might be a little bit more or a little bit less. I'm not sure if Jefferson can corroborate that number. So all that said, we're trying to make sure we're as thorough as possible, but of course, this is tricky and imperfect business. The end-of-term archive, the 2008 and the 2012 archives, are currently available through the California Digital Libraries hosted portal at eotarchive.cdlib.org, and the 2016 crawl data will soon be available there. We stopped crawling at the end of March, and so we're processing and creating metadata, and all of that will soon be available. There will be at least 3 caches of the content at the Internet Archive, the Library of Congress, and UNT, and we're looking into other ways to make this content accessible, of course. And with growing scholarly interest in corpus and network analysis, bulk data, and distant reading, these archives are ripe for reuse and bulk access. We're already getting questions from researchers at Stanford wanting bulk data, so we're hoping they'll go to the Internet Archive. There are also some affiliated efforts that are paralleling the end-of-term crawl, and so it's not just that we're crawling once every 4 years. There are other targeted efforts. For example, the Internet Archive has an election archive and a White House and social media archive. The Library of Congress has a campaign archive, and there are several others, mostly having to do with elections and social media of some sort. President Trump's Twitter feed is perhaps the single most archived Twitter feed of all time. Pardon the editorialization, but few can resist rubbernecking a wreck, so it seems. And with that, I think I'll hand it over to Jefferson. If Jonathan, you can switch the moderator to let Jefferson control those slides, I'll give it away to Jefferson.
Sure, it'll take me just a quick second.
Cool. Thanks, James. And my thanks as well to the SJSU crew and Jonathan especially for helping get us set up and coordinating.
All right, Mr. Bailey, you should be able to do it now. If you want to move your cursor around, it should be working.
Let's see if I can go to the next slide. I like that Blackboard Collaborate operates like on dial-up bandwidth speed. It's very interesting technical choice. Cool. So thanks, everyone. Thanks again for having us and letting us talk about the end of term. So this has been a pretty awesome year for government web and data archiving. As James sort of gave the background, we'll talk a little bit about what some research use that we've done. So this is the 3rd year. We did, as James mentioned, 2008, 2012, and then now this year. So the prior years gave us a little opportunity to do some comparative analysis, and we're just starting to get going on that for the current collection. But to continue the slides from before, James mentioned a number of affiliated efforts around the sort of outreach, getting students and classrooms involved. I think somebody put it in the chat, but there's a big effort that UNT is leading this year to get to basically crowdsource some of the metadata for the PDFs that we're collecting as part of the crawling, which are going to number in easily in the millions and probably even more than that. So, you know, when you get a PDF from a website, it doesn't necessarily come with a whole lot of metadata. It might be embedded in the PDF, but there's certainly no other information that's easily captured except for the URL that was on. So identifying government documents that have been collected via web crawling is a really interesting challenge that I think suits itself well to crowdsourcing that's worked in many other descriptive metadata application context. So the other affiliated effort, so you know, mentioned the crowdsourcing, not just the collecting and people nominated websites, but also like helping describe the content and analyze it and figure out what we have. But we also were lucky enough to work directly with the White House this year, and they reached out to us because the Obama administration was very cognizant of the openness and public domain nature of all the content that they had created, and they wanted to see it in as many places as possible and being used by as many people as possible. So we were just SWE Internet Archive, and it's just going into the end-of-term collection, so it's available to anyone for download. It's totally public and downloadable. They gave us dumps of Twitter and Vine and Tumblr, and I think one or two other social media channels, as well as giving us basically a list of the whole whitehouse.gov web architecture so that we could get a very good snapshot of it. So that was cool, and I think that sort of built off of you know, not just open access initiatives, but also the recognition that gov data and gov web data it changes a lot, and just because administrations change and administrators and agencies change and politicians change and things like that. So that was really cool to happen this year. So it is part of the collection as well. So how big are some of the end-of-term collections? You'll see in 2008, it was not a very large, what we call a seed list. A seed is basically just a website, and that's sort of where the crawler starts to crawl. So it's sort of what tells the crawlers where to start, and then they go out from there. So we collected around 102 million URLs, or 160 across all Library of Congress, Internet Archive, and UNT. Sometimes we focus on different parts of .gov and .mil. .mil is military, and so some people will focus on specific agencies or specific parts of the federal government web to collect them more intensively and more deeply than they might if they tried to get everything. It was about 18 terabytes in total, and with some, you know, duplication. In 2012, the seed list was almost twice as big, and we got about the same number of URLs, and that was mostly because it was deduplicated, which means content that had not changed. We did not archive a second time. We basically just make a note that it hasn't changed, and there you go. It was a little bit bigger, but generally not all that much bigger. So there were fewer URLs, but about the similar data size. So the reason that, or to account for that sort of change, is that, you know, the web has become much more a media platform, not just text on a web page, but there's audio and video and animations, and those tend to be quite large files, and that sort of makes the size similar even if it's much fewer actual individual web pages. So that's a high-level overview of what the first two crawls look like. And those are the ones that, and this is mostly the work of Mark Phillips, who is, I think, Director of Digital Libraries at University of North Texas. I might have got his title wrong. Maybe he's Associate University Librarian. But he does amazing work at UNT on digital library stuff. And so he had a IMLS grant to do an analysis of these two crawls to try to get some comparison, because the three institutions that are doing a lot of the actual, going out and grabbing and archiving, there's others contributing in other ways too, but this is an interesting comparative point because we're mostly all using the same tools as far as crawling and indexing and Wayback and stuff like that. So what Mark did was basically, take big index files of these first two end-of-term crawls and compare them to see what individual institutions were getting differently from each other and what the shape of the overall collections look like. So you'll see, on the right, some pie charts around what each institution was collecting that was unique just to their archiving efforts and what was shared. And so you see, even though in many cases we were using some of the same seed list and focusing on the same websites, the uniqueness of our individual archived URLs was quite high, so that's very cool. And then on the left, a super interesting statistic, which is comparing the PDFs that were discovered in 2012 with the ones that were discovered in 2008, and how many were gone and how many were still online. And it's a pretty shocking percentage of PDFs, and you can see it's 3 million missing and 775,000 found. So that's a pretty shocking metric of change across only 4 years, especially for PDFs, which tend to not necessarily be as endangered as like a web page because they're less likely to change. So that's a super fascinating number. He did some other kind of bar charts to look at the sort of crawling schedule, and the end of term essentially aims to archive for about 3 months before the inauguration and then 3 months after, so that we get a good snapshot on either side of a presidential change, which is when the government web changes its most. And at the agency level, obviously whitehouse.gov generally changes entirely if the president changes, and other aspects. So this is sort of looking at a very intensive crawling effort. You can't make, the dates are a little blurry, but the huge green spike is basically the inauguration, middle January. So we definitely ramp up the crawling around then, as far as like the URLs that we're trying to capture right before they might change. So we'll make the slides available so you can look at a lot of these. A TLD is a top-level domain. That basically means like whitehouse.gov. White House is the domain name, so it's called a top-level domain because all the pages are below that domain name. So you can think of it just sort of a website home page URL. But so we look at TLDs a lot to see what's the extent of the government web, at least as far as registered domain names. It won't necessarily account for the size or the number of total pages, but it gives a good sense of how namespaces change, and that can be indicative of content change as well. And so the number of unique TLDs is actually pretty similar in the number of common TLDs remains pretty static as well. If we look at the unique domain names, and that can include subdomains and basically anything to the left of .gov, you'll see quite a growth in unique domain names over the 4 years. So that's quite an interesting stat in that people started making more elaborate and descriptive domain level names, which just means that the complexity of their websites was changing and content was increasing without them necessarily having to register full domains. Subdomains, as I mentioned, similar statistic. These are mostly showing the expansiveness of the GovWeb over time just through the registration of domain names. So it gets interesting when we start to look at the ones that actually change the most. So com, gov, mil, net, edu, int, some of these others. .ly, of course, is going to be a URL shortener. Get .ly or other .lys were early web domains just for URL shorteners. So you see, hey, wow, there's a lot more URL shorteners in 2012. Became quite common between the two crawls, and that's recognized here. .NET probably not very used all that early in 2008 era government web. So let's see. Anyway, that's TLD change. We'll keep going. There's some .ly and .me. So .me might not have even existed in 2008. I'm not exactly sure. But you can sort of start to do this comparative analysis that allows you to see how the web has changed sort of in a holistic view. Some other interesting ones are when you get to sort of more specific sites. You can see this is, I think, number of URLs that were archived. And so when you look at the ones like Navy or House.gov and Summit.gov are kind of the obvious ones, but some of these sites got much bigger between 2008 and 2012, especially if they are publicly focused on delivering, content and news and they're, serving their constituents. So that was some other interesting ones. What are some ones that disappeared between our first two end-of-term archiving efforts? Geodata.gov, and you can look some of these up. We'll share the slides and look at them in the Wayback Machine or whatnot, since they'll be in 2008, not in 2012. And you can see the URLs sort of indicate the relative size. So, geodata.gov was actually quite a big website to entirely disappear over the course of 4 years. So some of these are more specialized, or maybe were specific government initiatives that only had a limited time span to begin with. But in others may have been assumed into larger websites. DARPA obviously is the Defense Agency Research Projects Administration. They probably got folded into a .mil domain or became a subdomain of something else. So you get the sort of disappearance and the movement of content around the government web. Not showing me the arrow. Not sure how to advance the slide if I can't see the arrow. Oh, there it is. Okay, good stuff. Okay, so that was sort of mostly Mark Phillips doing his own research on 2008 and 2012, and I thought I would talk about some efforts to give data mining and computer scientists and other researchers big chunks of .gov web archive data for them to work with. So one effort we did was working with political scientists at the University of Washington, social scientists at Rutgers, and information scientists at a research institute in Germany called L3S. And these people were interested in like all of .gov web archive, pretty much as they could get, because they are running huge high performance computing networks where they're looking at millions and billions of things at any one time and doing big processing jobs. So this was a sort of research and development effort to how can we support data mining projects that are interested in doing analysis similar to Mark's, but like on the content itself and not just the index. So this was the sort of .gov project, and we took 100 terabytes of .gov, which included all the end of terms as well as some additional stuff from Internet Archive's Web Archive, and basically put it in a third-party platform called Altascale and said, hey, come and use the data, all you people who are interested in data mining stuff. And pretty much nobody showed up. So there were 1 or 2 projects that came out of it, but for the level of effort involved in moving the data from Internet Archive to Altascale, getting people user accounts, and helping manage their processing efforts. It turned out to be have many hurdles around the user management and people just not necessarily being able to deal with this big tranche of data. So there are challenges because a lot of them weren't necessarily familiar with web archives or how crawling worked, or how there wasn't really any metadata except for what is in the website. So it exposed a lot of interesting challenges that I think the web archiving community is still grappling with. But it is a big slice of the government data that is available for people to do computational research on. Another effort that we've tried to make, so if 100 terabytes is too much data for you, how can we make data sets out of this collection that are smaller and easier for people to work with and might have a more understandable shape and content? And so we've been trying to make web archive data sets, which is like, it's not the whole web page, it might just be all the page titles or maybe all the links on a page, or other sort of metadata or data elements within a web page that can be extracted and put in a data set and then given to people. So, you can have like metadata like the links or the page title. You can have all the people names or place names in a whole website extracted and with a timestamp and all these other characteristics. So we won't have to go into too many details, but it's another attempt to get researchers the data that's in this awesome collection, but in a way that might be easier for them to use. And doing this work with a number of these institutions and making data sets has actually led to some pretty fantastic community events focused on helping researchers use web archives. So there's been a number of hackathons at Library of Congress. We had one here at Internet Archive. There's the Archives Unleashed project, which basically brings researchers together for 2 or 3 days, gives them government data, and they play around with it, and they get a little expertise and hand-holding. They've done similar things in Europe and in Canada as well. And there's an online workshop. It's oriented towards the semi-technically proficient as far as the ability to run scripts and stuff. But if you are interested or have some fluency with the command line terminal or things like that, then you might want to check out our Archives Research Workshop. But basically, .gov has been a good entry point for researchers that are interested in using web archives but don't really know where to start as far as the content, because we have so much web archive material across all our web archiving institutions. .gov sort of makes sense for people, and also, of course, it's public domain, so it's very easy to just have people use it without getting into too many challenges. If folks don't know about the new beta Wayback Machine, it is basically already out in production. You can go to web-beta.archive.org. And we have built a whole portal. It's still in testing, but it'll be out soon. That is the new Wayback Machine, which has keyword search and some metadata search. And we're doing that on web archives. So if you're still just interested in the traditional model of looking at an old website, we should have some search capabilities in Wayback Machine for that, just for the .gov stuff. And we're also doing similar kind of stuff with statistics. So you can see the screenshot on the left is just sort of the raw information, and on the right, and this is part of the new beta Wayback Machine, you can look at the summary stats for a whole host or domain. So here, justice.gov is the DOJ, and you can search by specific types of content, how many PDFs do they have, how many image files, and get a little charting and tell it what year to look at and stuff like that. So there's other ways to interact. You can replay the web page, but you can also interact with some of the high-level stats. So it's just yet another effort to try to build interesting new access points and ways to use the web archive. And then we've also extracted every PowerPoint and PDF and made full text search on it. So some of these aren't quite out yet, but they'll be in a blog post in the next month or two. But you should basically be able to put in keywords and say something like MIME type PDF from a year. Give me every PDF that has taxes in the name from a specific year, and that should go across the whole collection. So that'd be an interesting way to look at specific types of media and not just at the web pages themselves. And yeah, using that, we do sometimes fun times, special little collections. So we extracted every PowerPoint collection from .mil, the whole military government web, all public, all on the public web, and you can click and get them on the regular web. And so we just took every single one we've ever seen and put them into a special collection and turned the PowerPoints into PDFs and then OCR'd them so that you can search the text of a PDF, and of course you get the awesome crazy graphics of military PowerPoint presentations, which are insane. Okay, so that was a little context of research support and comparative analysis of the prior two. And as James mentioned, we just kind of wrapped up the post-inauguration bookend part of the crawl for this year in late, or basically end of March, a little into April, so maybe a month ago. And we are in the process of indexing and processing and doing some of the back-end work that's necessary before it goes up online. But this year was exciting because not only were there more public events, as James mentioned, and more crazy amount more nominations, but we also had a lot more partners directly participating in the project. So not just the core members, but George Washington University collects a lot of social media, so they were very focused. The government publishing office actually has a very large web archiving program, and so they were very involved this year in helping do QA and find websites and stuff like that. And others across the federal government and Stanford and James too. So a lot more partners, so that was exciting. Here's kind of what the overall timeline looked like when it happened. As I mentioned, we basically start crawling in the fall and do it 3 months before the election and 3 months after. So, we mostly finished everything in March, and I did mention we are probably going to continue a little bit, at least here at IA, because there's been so much interest and we've gotten so many nominations of websites and they keep coming in, and so we didn't want to just end the whole project. So we are continuing to seed nominations into a government web data archiving project. So it's not end of term because we want end of term to have a start and an end so that it is comparable to prior years and has a sort of organic whole, but it doesn't keep us from continuing to archive the government web. Our strategies in this current one, we wanted to have more people doing more crawling, more affiliated communities involved. We had a listserv that had a lot more members than prior years, and worked directly with the White House. So we mentioned, or worked directly with the government. We mentioned the White House, but we worked also with data.gov. We worked directly with the GSA, which, as James mentioned, is the sort of internet services provider for the federal government. So they gave a seed list and helped us make connections and hooked us up with people that could, point us to APIs that might have more seeds and registries and other things that we could scrape to make the crawl better. And we have updated the portal and some of the other access efforts that I already mentioned. Our opportunities this year were not just to have more crawling, and we also used a number of new crawling technologies, but through some of the coordinated data refuge and EDGI events to build web archiving capacity at other organizations. So some of those events people are actually crawling, or they work for institutions that are also crawling, and we've gotten a lot more researcher engagement. I'm running a little short on time, so I'm probably going to maybe try to plow through the rest of these in the next couple of minutes so that we have time for Q&A. And I know there have been some good questions in the chat box, which I haven't quite been able to follow. But, well, somebody is corralling them, and we'll revisit them. What are our challenges? Well, the web just continues to grow. The volume, the proliferation, the amount of media and YouTube and Vimeo and video is just crazy. So James mentions it's a sort of passion project of the institutions that are involved. So it's none of our day jobs to do this. There's no dedicated staffing. So the growth of the size as well as the growth and the attention to the issue this year has been a challenge. We don't do much cataloging or QA. We mentioned efforts to try to help on that with PDFs and stuff, so that would be great if we could get more crowdsourcing, because it's, as I'll show in a minute, it's hundreds of millions of individual files, so it'll be work. We had more partners, which meant more project management, which of course is always a challenge for sweat equity projects. We had a lot more seed lists, which is a good thing actually, and then some of the other limitations I already mentioned. What did we start with? So there is a registry of every registered social media account in the federal government. It's about 9,000, and I put the percentages there. We made a real effort this year to find every single website that has ever existed for .gov and crawl. Because if it doesn't exist anymore, it doesn't really affect the crawling at all. So I think our final seed list was about 190,000. And if you remember the slides from the earlier ones, they were like 3,000 and 5,000. So we were just get everything as far as putting it in the seed list and let it go. A lot more crowdsourced nominations as we saw before, and then some other donated lists as well. What does it look like since we just sort of ended? Well, here at Internet Archive, we have 240 terabytes. So that's pretty huge. It's about 1/4 of a petabyte. So that's a lot. We have basically two different sections of it. One is all the web stuff, and then we did a lot of FTP. And that is mostly where, in the 90s, FTP servers would host data sets. So it's not really web pages. It's more just a storage kind of mechanism. And you can archive it. It doesn't really replay because there's not really anything to look at except for the file, so you just end up downloading the file. But we really tried to preserve those because they're endangered, since FTP is not used all that much anymore, but a lot of the government FTP sites are still up. As far as the web URLs, we got over 300 million, so that's a pretty good number, and about 12,000 FTP files. And we're working on some of the host stats. Library of Congress got about 35 terabytes, and UNT got about 18. So we'll be merging them all together and figure out what was duplicated, and we'll get rid of duplication, and then we'll get some sort of entire crawling effort stats. Our entire end of term collection, which I think is, you can search for it on archive.org and you'll find it. All the files are downloadable. It's, in web archive format, so they're not necessarily user friendly. We put them in a pre and post inauguration collection so that people understood how the two snapshots happened, and we'll be blogging more about it. Lots of conversations with researchers. We have APIs in development, which is just a programmatic way that you can interact with the files and the data sets that I've mentioned. And we are still continuing to archive, and we're continuing to work with EDGI and Data Rescue and others in getting their collecting. They've been collecting, and we're going to take copies of their data too. So that should be pretty exciting. I mentioned that we're going to continue to crawl even though EOT is over. So there's a new UNT nomination tool for Government Web and Data Archives, and there's the URL, so we'll share it. Anything you put in there comes to us, and we crawl it. So if people are interested in continuing to nominate, I certainly encourage them. There's what the collection looks like in archive.org, and you can see the two pre and post collections. Yeah, all right, last slide. So we have a little time left. What are we going to do in the future? We're going to continue to crawl and form partnerships and work with community efforts as well as with other libraries and archives to both capture but also to make accessible. We're going to redo the portal, EOT portal that's hosted by California Digital Library, as well as figure out some of the other access methods that I gave a high-level overview of. Everything's public. It's .gov. It's public domain. So if you want it, take it. If you want some of it, take that part. All of it, take it. It's a lot. And then continue with the community building. So Data Refuge and EDGI have just done amazing work in hosting what must be, I don't know, over 100 events at this point, and building tools for people to have their own datathons or hackathons or nomination-a-thons. So really the community building this year, which is something that those of us doing the web archiving don't have a lot of time or bandwidth for, has been fantastic. And there's the listserv, and I think this is the last slide, so I think we're done as far as us presenting.